You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
On April Fool's Day 2018, the very first episode of the Saving Elephants podcast dropped. And if you're listening to this episode on the first day it drops, April the 1st, 2025, it is exactly 7 years to the day Saving Elephants as a podcast began. I, of course, am your host, Josh Lewis, and I both can and cannot believe it has been a solid 7 years of me doing this podcast. Now, of course, the title of this episode begins 174, meaning this is the 174th episode of the podcast, but that's a little misleading because that does not include bonus episodes or roundtable discussions I also include. We are just 1 or 2 episodes shy of actually passing the 200 mark. I don't think I'm going to do anything to commemorate that until we have actual full-blown episodes that pass 100, not passing on a technicality, but passing with actual episodes. But it has been a remarkable 7 years, and thank you so much to everybody who has both hung with me this entire time and all of the newcomers. We welcome one and all. We hope you have both enjoyed your time here, but that it has also been informative, and most of all, I hope it has been encouraging and enriching, especially in an era where our politics seems so exhausting. And as Jonah Goldberg often says, podcast host of The Remnant, whenever the news is crazy, he likes to do counter-programming of talking about some obscure, nerdy subject. And since on this podcast we love to delve into the historical, intellectual tradition of conservatism, this episode will be no exception. My guest in this conversation is David Byrne, whose recent book, aptly named James Burnham, explores the intellectual journey of James Burnham, an individual who was immensely important in the conservative movement of the prior century, and that his international views on how to deal with the menace of the Soviet Union and global communism influenced the likes of Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan, and ultimately became policy of the United States in our approach to the communist. And he had a long career at the very beginning of National Review with William F. Buckley, and in that regard, shaped conservative messaging and ideas for decades. So who was James Burnham exactly? What did he believe? How might that inform what we think of conservatism today? Well, it's super complicated, as we will get into this conversation with David Byrne. But before we turn to that, one last little announcement. I have recently joined Substack, primarily to have a central place where I can curate all of the happenings here at Saving Elephants, from YouTube clips, panel discussions, podcast episodes, blog posts, and also inform you when I have had the opportunity and the honor of appearing on other podcasts and shows, to give you a sense of some of the things I'm reading and possibly even sprinkle in some banjo video clips here and there. I want this to be in a central hub, a central place where I curate all these things together and send them out on no more than a monthly basis. You can find this, of course, on Substack, which I will link to in the show notes. But maybe most importantly, you can go to that link and subscribe to the email so that you actually will get this in your inbox on a monthly basis and not have to remember to go to Substack. It'll just automatically come to you. It's relatively easy to subscribe. Again, just look for the link in the show notes. And I would be honored if you would join me on this new platform. But with that, I give you my conversation with David Byrne about James Burnham.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants Show.
David, your previous book was on the intellectual biography of Ronald Reagan. Now, James Burnham is someone who I think is incredibly important, but admittedly far less known than Reagan. So what led you from Ronald Reagan, this figure everyone's got some idea of, to a admittedly more obscure person, though nonetheless important?
Well, Josh, I think really the relationship between the two is that they had a strong intellectual relationship because Burnham heavily influenced Ronald Reagan. Reagan acknowledged his debt to Burnham, and I really became familiar with Burnham's, at least geopolitical philosophy, while I was studying and researching Reagan. And I began to realize what a significant figure that James Burnham was in the history of American conservative thought, specifically related to Reagan, the way he influenced Reagan's Cold War policies. Burnham, of course, was one of America's foremost anti-communists. And unlike many Americans, even some conservatives who wanted containment policies preached by George Kennan, of course, Burnham demanded rollback. He wanted to end the Soviet Union, end communism, bust communism. And these ideas really heavily influenced Reagan. So that's kind of how I first became acquainted with Burnham's geopolitical philosophy.
His anti-communism, of course, is something we'll flesh out at great length probably over the conversation. And two, I think we would develop this more in the conversation. But in way of introduction, I like how throughout the entire book you introduce James Burnham as if he is two James Burnhams. Your optimist and your pessimist, your neocon, your paleoconservative. Can you just briefly for us explain why is his writing seemingly two different individuals packaged into one?
That's a great question, Josh, because what I argue in my book is that there were two James Burnhams. One was more internationally oriented. He's sometimes considered to be a forerunner to the neoconservative movement. Specifically, this James Burnham preached a hardline, aggressive foreign policy against the Soviet Union. He even preached violence because Burnham believed that the Soviet regime, the totalitarian regime, could be overthrown. He did write a book called The Coming Defeat of Communism, in which he predicted the defeat of communism. And, I argue this is a more optimistic Burnham who believed that if the United States properly used pressure, properly used force, properly used power, both hard power and soft power, he optimistically believed that it could lead to the end of communism and the Soviet Union. So that was kind of a more optimistic Burnham that I argue exists. The second James Burnham was a little more domestically oriented. He certainly helped influence what today is called paleoconservatism. And, someone like Donald Trump descends a little bit more from this intellectual tradition in that they're a little more pessimistic about America. They're more domestically oriented. They're a little more isolationist. And, in this James Burnham's opinion, again, relevant today, is that America was coming under the control of a group of clandestine bureaucrats who held too much power. Burnham propounds these ideas in a book called The Managerial Revolution, another book called Congress in the American Tradition, in which he asserts pessimistically that, America is not really a democracy, rather we're ruled by a bureaucratic elite. And, this is a little more pessimistic paleoconservative America. Today, the terms more loosely used are things like the establishment, the administrative state. Trump wants to drain the swamp.
The deep state.
Deep state, exactly. So these are all related to Burnham's ideas that a bureaucratic elite, kind of a second level of government, a deep state, exists below the apparent government, and is the second level of government that really controls the levers of power, and really they're the enemies of democracy. And again, consistent with some conservative views preached by President Trump, is that if we want a democracy in the United States, which we don't have now in their opinion, we need to limit the political power of this deep state, administrative state, the establishment, etc.
So, and admittedly, I'm skipping very far ahead here, but I'm just, as I was reading your book, I was blown away by this idea that Burnham, he was National Review editor. Of the editors, he was possibly the most, or at least one of the most friendly towards LBJ's Great Society. He wasn't as critical of the, I'll put it this way. He wasn't as given to the free market laissez-faire arguments that many of the national reviews are. All that being said, it still seemed very shocking to me that he supported Rockefeller over Goldwater. Because now, domestically, I get it. That makes sense. Makes complete sense. But it just seems like an individual who spent so much of his life and vigor that the gold star was the Soviet Union. Communism has to be defeated. We have to apply force. If there was ever a presidential candidate that seemed to be more, I don't know that even Reagan, you could say, in rhetoric anyways, rose to the level that Goldwater did. And granted, I know some of that's through Brent Bozell's writings and Conscience of the Conservative, but it just seemed like, man, if ever there was a candidate you'd think Burnham would have been all over, it would have been Goldwater. So what was his animosity towards Goldwater?
Yeah, I think he just preferred, keep in mind that Goldwater has the reputation of being liberal. He was hard on the Cold War. He was by no way, shape, or form soft on communism. I know Burnham really liked the fact that Rockefeller, opposed any bans on testing nuclear weapons. So at least in Burnham's mind, you're 100% right. Of course, Goldwater was a hardline anti-communist, but Burnham would have argued that, Rockefeller isn't soft on communism in any way. So I think Burnham just appreciated Gould. Like you suggested, Rockefeller was a little more liberal on social issues, economic issues, and I think Burnham just appreciated that. While at the same time, Rockefeller in no way, shape, or form was could be called soft on communism. So.
We should probably start then with not Burnham the hardliner against communism, but Burnham the communist. And this is a story we hear over and over and over, especially of right-wing intellectuals of this era, the 1930s, 40s. They start sometimes not only on the left, but on the hard left. And Burnham was no exception here. I mean, it's interesting that he's an individual who, the way you describe in your book, never seems to completely shed his Leninism, but does seem to manage to completely shed his Marxist, Stalinist, Trotskyite views. And it might be an interesting story how he came by those, but I'm more fascinated in because I try to think of what it is that leads people from Marxism to, in some regards, the polar opposite. I mean, you got some individuals reject it so much that they reject all ideologies. And so maybe they'll take the Russell Kirk approach of, well, conservatism negates ideologies, therefore I can be a conservative. And I think of Whittaker Chambers in his book Witness. He described his conversion, or those he knew who had converted, maybe you call it deconverted, anyhow, left the communist movement, as they heard a scream. It was something primal in them, that some human aspect still left in their soul existed, that when they saw some suffering of someone, it touched them in a way that said, wait a minute, this is wrong, this is not right. I get the sense it wasn't that way for Burnham. What was it? And I know he sort of slowly gets there because he sort of still has Marxist ideas, even with the managerial, not the Machiavellians, but the managerial class. But what was it that caused him to break so far, not just from Stalinism, but from communism entirely?
Yeah, I think you're right. It was a more slow, deconversion, if you want to put it. And yeah, like unlike someone like Chambers, it didn't happen overnight. He didn't, have some sort of, magnificent dream or, some magnificent thought at one moment. It was more of a gradual moment. And to be honest, it was, a little generic, like many leftists and many people at the time. He just began to resist Stalinism and the Soviet experiment, and it really took several years. I'd say 1937 he began to have some concerns, and so the same time that Stalin's purges are reaching their peak. Of course, there's famine in the Ukraine. The Soviet Union is clearly not a democracy in any way, shape, or form. That becomes clear by the late 1930s. Of course, 1940. You begin to have, the origins of World War II, 1941 or 1940. Of course, you have the Stalin-Hitler Pact. This threw a bunch of communists, for a loop. Certainly Burnham too. Trotsky. They had to, try to use Marxism to try to, interpret the Stalin-Hitler Pact, and it just became a little intellectually awkward. And of course, the last straw for Burnham was really when the Soviets invaded Poland from the east, roughly shortly after the Nazis did from the west. I think just a combination of all these events. And, for Trotsky, this is a good thing that the Soviets, are invading Poland. But, by this time, Burnham, after, several years of trying to, reconcile all these crazy events, the Nazi-Soviet pact, Stalin's purges, a lack of any sort of freedom in the Soviet Union, the Soviet invasion of Poland, all these events put together began to, slowly change Burnham's mind. And this culminated in around May of, 1940 when he officially leaves the Communist Party.
Well, and I know that obviously Stalin's moves during, pre-World War II and up through World War II caused a lot of heartache among, the Marxists who it was this pure utopian way of reorganizing society, right? Lenin was and I'm no fan of Lenin, but he was portrayed as the pure principled driven individual. And when you get to this moment that the Marxists break, seems like in two camps. One is the more Trotskyite view of Stalin's the problem. Marxism is fine. It's Stalin that's the problem.
Exactly.
And it seemed like at first Burnham was willing to go along with that, but eventually gets to, no. Stalin is actually the embodiment of Marxism.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Burnham wrote an important piece in the early 1940s called Lenin's Heir, in which he makes precisely that argument. And he says, hey, man, hey, Stalin is like the perfect Bolshevik. He's the perfect Marxist. And, everything that has happened, it wasn't Stalin, it's Marxism. And by now, Burnham's largely abandoned Leninism too, at least as a domestic communist philosophy. He says no, Stalin is the perfect Leninist. So everything about communism, Stalin hasn't betrayed the revolution, which, as you just alluded to, many Marxists such as Trotsky argued. Rather, what Burnham argues in this piece called Lenin's Heir is that Stalin has fulfilled the Bolshevik revolution. He's the perfect Bolshevik. He's the perfect Marxist. He's the perfect communist, not Lenin.
And it's fascinating because he doesn't. He obviously denounces Stalin. In a lot of ways, he denounces Trotsky. Does he ever reserve such criticism for Lenin as, because I'm trying to think how to put this. It seems like he continues to adopt Lenin's impatience, as you put it, right?
Yeah,
Something
absolutely.
must be done now.
Right.
But a lot of times when they break with Marxists, they'll turn to and I know that Burnham's complicated because he eventually embraces Burke too.
Right.
They'll turn more towards Burkean, wait a minute, maybe patience and prudence and let's think through this. But he never lost that kind of Leninist zeal, which is an odd combination.
Right. One of the things when you're studying the history of thought is, you can at the same time embrace a thinker and reject him because you're embracing parts of his thought. In this case, Burnham embraces Lenin's impatience, like you said, right? Something always needs to be done. For Lenin was the struggle against capitalism. Burnham kind of flips this on his head and he turns it into the idea that something always needs to be done in the struggle against communism. So he adopts that Leninist idea and he continues it for the rest of his political career, specifically as a hardline anti-communist. But at the same time, he did blame a lot of the tear, the internal domestic turbulence in the Soviet Union. He did blame a lot of that on Lenin. In one piece, he wrote that Lenin was more of a dictator, more bloodthirsty than Stalin. So he did. He says, "Hey man, everything in the Soviet Union, all the violence, all the death, all the destruction, to some degree, he does blame that on Lenin too." So yeah, like I said, he simultaneously embraces some Lenin's ideas while rejecting others.
Someone who is writing this space this voraciously about communism, of course, you couldn't write a book about Burnham without bringing up his views on McCarthy, right? In the McCarthy trials, the witch hunt, the Red Scare in the United States, Senator Joseph McCarthy specifically. And I don't know that he was the one that coined it, but I think you could apply the exact same phrase, certainly to William F. Buckley and maybe Brent Bozell Jr., that they were anti-McCarthy. In other words, it wasn't so much they were saying, I'm pro-McCarthy. It's the individuals who are anti-McCarthy are going so far that they're ignoring the fact there's a real and present danger of communists working within the society. I bring that up, and I mentioned earlier Whittaker Chambers. I found it curious. Obviously, I was expecting you to talk about McCarthy, and you do in the book. Whittaker Chambers gets a single mention in this book. And I thought that was odd because Chambers, it would seem like, I'm really curious what Chambers and Burnham's relationship were, and that they had some sort of National Review affiliations. And they also were both ex-communists or ex-Marxist. Chambers himself was, in a lot of ways blew the lid off, maybe not the Ware Group, but Alger Hiss's involvement in the United States government under the FDR administration and Yalta. And, he became sort of the poster boy on the right for, wait a minute, here's an actual example we can all point to. This is actually happening. There are actual communists in the U.S. government trying to subvert things. Now, Chambers, if I remember correctly, was much more cool on Joseph McCarthy. Maybe it's fair to say he was also anti-McCarthy, but I think he was also much more reticent to in any way align himself, saying, this guy's kind of, and these are my words, I could be mischaracterizing him, this guy's a bit of a crackpot. If we get aligned with him, our cause may be tainted and people may not take us serious. So what was Burnham's views on, I guess, both Chambers and that kind of general approach to, let's keep this guy at a distance?
Yeah, like you said, Burnham is another classic anti-McCarthyite. He basically said, look, McCarthy has done good and bad things, and we should support the good things he has done, and we should criticize the bad things he has done. And, of course, at this time, by now we're in the early 1950s, Burnham is writing for a lot of left-wing publications like Partisan Review, and this was not sufficient for them. For most liberals at this time, you needed to be unequivocally condemn Joseph McCarthy, and that wasn't sufficient. Burnham's, kind of moderate attitudes weren't sufficient for most liberals. So, he became, so he kind of, was exiled from, any liberal movement. But in terms of Whittaker Chambers, part of the reason I don't discuss Whittaker Chambers a lot in my book, is that I just didn't, Burnham didn't write about him a lot. So, I'm tracing Burnham's writings, I'm tracing his articles, I'm reading his books, and Burnham did just not write about Whittaker Chambers a lot. Obviously, they knew each other. Obviously Burnham would have read Witness, like any conservative would have at the time. It's still a classic. But Burnham just kind of fell into kind of the same camp as as Chambers, who kind of described themselves as anti-McCarthyites.
Yeah. And I find it interesting because Chambers was also someone who in rhetoric was very, not like Burnham necessarily, but in rhetoric was extremist, but like in actual policies was a more Beaconsfield conservative. Like he wasn't as anti-Great Society. And, he was much like Burnham, anti-liberal in the sense that the liberals were not taking the communist threat serious, not anti-liberal in the sense that, well, they want a progressive society and that's going to doom our free market or some sort of American order, if you will. If I've got that correct, I don't know if that I don't know if you'd agree with that or not.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. Yeah. So, but yeah, I think, the important thing for Burnham and McCarthy, even Chambers, you can align Chambers and Burnham in the idea that, that they're both strongly anti-communist. They both had a conversion. They did have a communist history, but then they converted, and as you noted too, they both became National Review contributors.
Yeah, although Chambers quit shortly thereafter.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Burnham stuck on for quite a long while.
Right.
So I wanted to turn to containment versus liberation. The notion that it was George Kennan, famous diplomat, who I guess maybe is fair to say best embodied a these are my words, anti-communist containment strategy for our response to communism, which was essentially, communist nations exist here and nowhere else. Like if they're going to try to invade or infiltrate other countries or upset elections, we're going to be right. We meaning the free world are going to be there to prevent them from spreading. This was not Burnham's view. In fact, it was so far not Burnham's view that he often accused the containment crowd of being, useful idiots or maybe even secretly pro-communist in some sense. So if not containment, which is the one we're far more familiar with, and it existed, maybe not Truman, but certainly Eisenhower and on down through President Reagan, it seemed most administrations were practicing this doctrine. What was it Burnham was essentially advocating, if not containment?
Burnham was advocating rollback. He said we need to bust the Soviet system. We need to end communism. He argued that containment can never win. Containment can't win the Cold War because it's merely a defensive strategy. And a defensive strategy can never win for Burnham. So, of course, containment, like you said, the idea that, we can allow the Soviet Union to control Eastern Europe. We just can't allow it to spread. Burnham said, no, we need to maybe even invade Eastern Europe. Minimally support, free people or support, anti-Soviet Union movements in Eastern Europe. So at least we need to support them. We need to help these people of Eastern Europe to free themselves from Soviet control, from Soviet yoke. So Burnham criticized Kennan. He criticized containment. Like you said, he even suggested, incorrectly, of course, that, these containment people were somehow pro-communist, which, wasn't true in any way, shape,
right.
or form. But so Burnham, rollback, liberation of Eastern Europe. So and he compared the two. He wrote a book called Containment or Liberation, in which he described containment as a defensive policy, which, like I said, he believed could never win, and he compared it with liberation. He compared all the advantages of liberation. For example, liberation, we're always on the offensive. For example, liberation can pose a threat to communists. Where containment, one day you're fighting the communists, when they invade somewhere, then when they stop invading, you step back. And Burnham hated this inconsistency of containment. So he said with rollback, liberation, you're consistently fighting the Soviets, you're consistently placing pressure on the Soviets. So that's how he distinguished between containment and liberation.
So I can certainly understand in this era, being this hardline against communism would no doubt make your sensible liberals, who are not communist, right, who want to end the Soviet Union, think that this guy is nuts, and that this is leading into, what was arguably the most infamous political ad of all time when Goldwater was running for president against LBJ, and Democrats ran the ad of a little girl picking petals off a daisy, beginning a countdown, 10, 9, 8, and then her voice is sort of overpowered by, it sounds like somebody announcing the NASA rocket shooting off, 10, 9, 8 countdown, and then when it gets to 0, there's a nuclear mushroom cloud. The implication is, if you let Goldwater, we're going to have a nuclear winter. And Burnham was honestly kind of, I wouldn't say eager, but was certainly not willing to rule out the possibility of nuclear arms against the Soviet Union. And I'm bringing this up in part to say that in a lot of ways, as I mentioned earlier, all the way up through President Reagan, it seemed like the administrations were practicing containment. When we get to Reagan, there's a difference. There's a shift. But I also note it's not entirely what Burnham's advocating. It's not, Reagan is far more reticent about I shouldn't say let's start a war, but that violence is necessary, or that, this is ultimately going to come to brinksmanship of nuclear arms, if you will. In fact, it seemed like Lincoln was far more about, it's almost like Lincoln agreed with the containment idea of the Soviet Union contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. We need to wait it out, except he wanted to amplify that by building up a military arm. So long preamble to maybe a simple question. Was Reagan, who's obviously influenced by Burnham, how much of Burnham's ideas did he actually take, or was it kind of a mixture of the two?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think a mixture is the best way to put it. He certainly agreed with Burnham that the United States needs to use force and power against the Soviet Union. For example, investing heavily in the military. Now, of course, that's not the same as saying, well, we need to use the military, which Burnham suggests. Burnham wanted to use the American military. He wanted to invest heavily in the American military. Well, Reagan, he did invest heavily in the American military. And I like to say that Reagan flexed American muscles. But, and this certainly was influenced by Burnham, because Burnham always believed that America needed to show strength. And one way that America could show strength and power was by investing in her military. And Reagan followed this idea. But I think you're right that Reagan was probably a little more reluctant to use military power. He was, willing to use the threat, right? Place missiles in Eastern Europe, pointing them at the Soviet Union. But of course, that's different than actually, launching missiles in Eastern Europe at the Soviet Union. So Reagan, kind of tried to walk a very fine line, which I think in hindsight he did relatively successful in, showing strength and using American power, but not so much that it literally leads to World War III and the destruction of the world. So yeah, Burnham was an apocalyptic thinker. Whether it be as a Marxist, he preached violent revolution, and then as a Cold Warrior, as you suggested, I don't think it's fair to say that Burnham wanted to use nuclear weapons.
Sure.
But, he was certainly more willing to use them than most any other American at the time. He did suggest that, maybe we need to use nuclear missiles. He said, there's a taboo in the world against using nuclear missiles, and this taboo only works against the United States. During Vietnam is when he really suggested the possibility of using nuclear missiles. He said, look, we're fighting this war in Vietnam. We need to win. If we're not ready to win, then, why are we fighting? And, nuclear missiles are the one big advantage we have. So, maybe we shouldn't fear using them. So, yeah, you're right. He did suggest the possibility of using nuclear missiles. And yeah, as that famous Goldwater commercial, if there's one person who kind of inspired that sentiment, that fear among, Democrats, James Burnham is probably as much responsible for, expressing those sentiments, those fears that, hey man, if Goldwater's elected, we could have nuclear annihilation.
Sure. Yeah, I would be hard pressed to think of another serious intellectual who would inspire more fear on the left than maybe these guys would push the button. And I even down to today, to the extent that James Burnham was kind of a what would you call that? A proto neocon, if you will. Jonah Goldberg often talks about in his podcast that the absurdity of how often we paint all neocons as if their lifelong ambition is just to start World War III and launch a nuclear weapon. It's not and look, I don't necessarily, if I lived back then, maybe I'd feel different. I don't know. I have the good pleasure of basically coming of age after the Soviet Union had fallen. But I suspect I would be far less hardliner than Burnham was, even if I would equally agree with him the Soviet Union was an evil empire, as Reagan put it. But it wasn't so much a romantic, how to put this? It wasn't so much a yearning for violence, but more a depiction of the world in such a way that unless we react with force and aggression, we're going to be overcome. And I think you've even written this in one part of the book where he's talking about, look, taking a strong stance at least somewhere will prevent us from having to do so in the future, because the Soviets and everyone will know, oh, they're serious about this. We can't push them this far. And the fact that we keep getting pushed back and back and back is actually a more dangerous world, and one that eventually, and you can see how these are very common to neoconservative arguments. Again, I'm not saying that you can't criticize a neoconservative, but I think you have to work within that framework of, okay, I understand how you're seeing the world. You're not for violence. You're trying to prevent violence.
Right. Yeah. Burnham interpreted the Soviet Union, the communists, as a bunch of bullies. Sometimes, for the bully, you have to strike back. You have to hit them hard. That's how you get them to stop. And Burnham's real, the way he saw the world, he believed violence, was natural, and even minimal, at least force or power. And he believed, if the United States is not using power, then power is going to be used against the United States. So he interpreted the international world as a giant struggle, and the United States needs to use power in the international arena, because if the United States isn't using power, power will be used against the United States. Many conservatives today, adopt these ideas in their interpretation of China. China is, using power to, work against the interests of the United States. And again, President Trump, to some degree, adopts these ideas by arguing, look, we need to do battle with China. We need to fight against China because, power, it dominates the international arena. So you're right. And, we need to use power, or else it will be used possibly even to destroy us.
Power in the face of the Soviet Union, of global communism, of Marxism, it makes sense. A lot of other right-leaning intellectuals would take a similar view or stance. What's interesting to me is the degree to which power infiltrated everything in Burnham's thoughts and writings. And it was almost, maybe I'm wrong here, but it almost seems like this holdover from the Marxist. It's all about class struggle. Like everything can be explained through this lens. Now, he changed sort of what the lens was, but at times it felt like I was almost reading a biography of Saul Alinsky, the degree to which he was so focused on the power struggle. Again, maybe international against communism makes sense, but he bore that out in a lot of ways, right? And I'm thinking specifically of his oh, good grief, why am I blanking? What was his managerial book?
The Managerial Revolution.
Thank you. I was blanking on the title. The way you're describing it, it seems evident there also that it's a constant struggle through life. And I'm not necessarily saying I disagree. I think this is one of those things. It's not a do you agree or disagree. It's to what degree do you see these things? And it seemed like for Burnham, it was turned up to an 11 at all
Yeah.
times. Everything was a power struggle.
Yeah, maybe even a 12 or 13. But yeah, again, he adopts this idea, from Marx, right? For Marx, the world's a power struggle. The first sentence of the Communist Manifesto, the history of the world is a history of class struggle, right? So struggle, conflict, power are natural for Marxists. And Burnham, kind of took this idea and ran with it. Domestically, there was a chapter in the Managerial Revolution, which is titled The Struggle for Power. And whereas Marx interpreted the world as a struggle between bourgeoisie and the proletariat, a power struggle, Burnham says, it's really a struggle or power struggle between the managerial class and the capitalist class. And ultimately, this idea would kind of be turned into by some of Burnham's disciples is, well, it's really a struggle against the dominant managerial bureaucratic class, really against the American masses. So you have this idea of a power struggle, which in the 21st century, again, you to some degree with Trump and many of his followers, that, again, what we describe the deep state, the establishment, the administrative state, however you want to put it, they're the ones exercising all the power. And in a democracy, it's when the people have power. So in order for the people to have power, we need to fight back against this administrative state, the deep state. So that's today how you see a power struggle, at least among the paleoconservative movement. And then, also there's this entire geopolitical philosophy, which we just discussed. We need to use power against the communists because Burnham specifically says all the communists care about is exercising power. They want power. Their demand to take private property, to get rid of private property, Burnham said, is really just their goal to acquire power, monopolize power. That's all the communists care about. And he says, again, our foreign policy, America's foreign policy, must be exercising power. This can be hard power, like we said, maybe even nuclear missiles, maybe even invading Eastern Europe, or even forms of soft power. Burnham was big on soft power too. Propaganda. He wanted to use propaganda to fight against communism too. It's not just hard power, but soft power. But yeah, you're right. Power was central to the ideas of James Burnham.
And it's not something that is foreign, I think, to probably any worldview or outlook, but the focus on power and struggle is far more comfortable for a lot of leftist ideologies. It's maybe fair to say comfortable for the paleocons, maybe the natcoms of today, the more those trying to imbue Trumpism with some sort of intellectual scaffolding. But there's a lot on the right that would not be okay with this paradigm of life's way more complicated than just shoving it all through this lens. So, well, see, and I even think of Buckley. I mean, he's a complicated figure, but I know he had kind of railed against this general notion. And certainly there's a lot of conservative intellectuals. Was Burnham taken to task by many conservatives over his reducing everything to this sort of power struggle?
Not that I know of. It was a philosophy that became to be associated with him. And yeah, I didn't really find a lot of uh, critics. George Orwell. You can't really call Orwell a conservative,
Right.
um, but he kind of took Burnham to task for
I
focusing.
know a lot of people took Burnham to task. I guess
Yeah,
I'm from this direction.
yeah. The conservatives, I didn't find a lot. He was such a respected, intellectual. Buckley always deferred to Burnham intellectually. He called Burnham National Review's number one, intellectual influence. So Burnham did not face a lot of opposition on the right for these ideas about power.
So let's turn to that then, because Burnham, of course, one of the many things he's known for is his influence, his mark at National Review. And you use this phrase, and it's probably correct. It never occurred to me that he co-founded National Review with William F. Buckley. I didn't realize that. I guess I always assumed it was Wilmore Kendall or maybe Brent Bozell that you could kind
Yeah,
of,
you
and
could say
maybe
that
it
was
was a
all of
group
it.
there. He was in there with the group. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
Um, what was his influence or mark at National Review?
It was certainly in the foreign policy area, his foreign policy writings. He was the magazine's foreign policy expert from 1955 to 1978. He wrote an article called "The Third World War," is later changed to "The Protracted Conflict." But it was basically a bi monthly column in which he would muse about the Cold War. Most commonly critique American foreign policy, criticize American foreign policy. Criticize Kennedy, criticize Eisenhower again for just not being hard enough on the communists. So his primary goal was to analyze communism, analyze foreign affairs. And again, he was primarily arguing that condemning even Dulles. Dulles was of course very hard line, but none of these guys were hard enough for Burnham. So it's usually just criticizing these foreign policymakers for not being willing to use enough power against the Soviet Union. And again, this is true of Kennedy, Eisenhower, Kennan, Dulles, etc.
I find it somewhat humorous the degree to which maybe it was just the accident of timing when National Review becomes the leading conservative magazine, and maybe when it launched, I don't know what you could call that, but becomes the leading conservative publication of the 20th century. That it seemed like one of their primary targets was the Eisenhower administration, and it was almost like it wasn't until they get to Kennedy they're like, oh, this is a bit more natural fit for us.
Yeah, Burnham's not. A lot of this can be traced to both Burnham and Buckley, but they both like to criticize and critique. In my book, I kind of relate this to Burnham, going all the way back to Karl Marx, because Karl Marx, he had a poisonous pen. He loved to attack, even fellow socialists. Marx criticized in his writings. So Burnham, Lenin inherited this from Marx. Lenin, of course, criticized, other Bolsheviks regularly. Burnham inherited this. He criticized other Marxists, even during his Marxist phase, during the 1930s, for example, Burnham is regularly criticizing Max Eastman, who's, another, famous leftist. So, Marx, Lenin, Burnham, they'd always even criticize people roughly of their own ilk, roughly, even though those, at least in theory, on their own side. And Eisenhower was a Republican, right? Obviously, he's very anti-communist. He's extremely anti, Soviet Union. And, he embraces many policies that reflect this, but, it was just never enough for, hardline extremists like Burnham.
Yeah, and that's certainly not reduced to just Buckley and Burnham. I mean, Wilmore Kendall, Frank Meyer, maybe to a degree Brent Bozell. I mean, they made an entire career out of punching right, if you will.
Right, right.
In fact, I thought it was interesting, and I did not know this, but his other book, he's famous for many books, Suicide of the West, not to be confused with the more recent Jonah Goldberg's copy of Suicide of the West. But Ewan made the statement that in a lot of ways, Suicide of the West is to be understood as a part of the larger debate between Bozell and Meyer. That debate, of course, is something we've talked about at length on this program, but just in way of reminders. The debate between Frank Meyer's idea of, he didn't coin the term, but fusionism, essentially that liberty and virtue are mutually reinforcing and necessary to coexist, and then Brent Bozell's elevation of virtue, if you will, over mere liberty. And of course, didn't take place necessarily in the pages of National Review to the best of my knowledge, but I know there were other libertarian thinkers that said, no, it's actually liberty above virtue. In what way does Burnham enter into this, or in what way did the Suicide of the West have something to do with this larger argument?
Well, the debates that you just described were to some degree, how do we preserve, how do we promote Western civilization? So those debates that you just described were largely, what's the best for Western civilization? Those two writers, National Review writers, they both, were pro-Westerners. They believed that the West, and Burnham too. They all three of them believed that the West was a unique civilization that needed to thrive, that needed to survive, and all three of them worried about the future of Western civilization. And Burnham too, he agreed that virtue is important. He believed liberty is important, but those were not necessarily his most important. For him, the West needed to be strong. For him, the big issue was fighting communism. That was Burnham's. How do we promote the West? How do we save the West? How do we ensure that the West is prosperous? Burnham said, we need to make sure that it use power against communism again, because if the West is not willing to use power against communism, then the West is going to fall. And these ideas, again, this is the more pessimistic Burnham. The paleoconservatives really like suicide of the West, and in many of their minds today, the West is falling, the West is under attack. Globalization. Burnham, even in the 1960s, Burnham was already preaching against globalization. We said how Burnham is an internationalist, right? He believed that the United States should interact with the rest of the world, use power in the international arena. But although he was an internationalist, he did not support globalism. Consistent with many, 21st century conservatives today, he believed that globalism worked against the interests of the United States. He believed that globalism worked against the interests of the West. So, his ideas about saving the West, promoting the West, meant fighting communism, fighting globalism. So that's kind of how he can be distinguished from the other two National Review editors.
I need to ask, because I'm of two minds here. One, I certainly understand the connective tissue of Burnham's, the pessimistic, the paleo Burnham, if you will, the managerial revolution, taking those texts and applying them to sort of the arguments of today of the global elite, the woke mob, if you will, right? The international organizations of maybe NATO, but certainly of the EU, the United Nations, the World Health Organization. There we go. All that being said, it feels also, this is my other mindset, it feels like a very bizarre substitute for what was unquestionably a far more violent, cantankerous, and dangerous enemy of global communism. Global communism was not only a poisonous ideology that could infect our universities and our corporations and our halls of government, but was also backed by, at one point, the largest nuclear stockpile on the planet and one of the most fearsome land armies certainly on the planet, and an obvious willingness to spread this force consistently, and multiple leaders who had demonstrated ruthless efforts at spreading this and consistently, making known what is the phrase that I trust a communist, that they're actually going to do what they say they're going to do. That's the one thing you can trust them about. It just seems like a very wimpy substitute to think that if Burnham were, and I know it's an unfair, if Burnham were alive today, I'm sure you're asked this a lot, but again, I don't doubt that he would probably in a lot of ways join the anti-globalist, anti-woke sentiment. In a lot of ways I do too, but to see them as on par with the Soviet Union or the communist threat, it just seems a little out of place.
Yeah, and Burnham did call them, neo-Marxists. So, he recognized, I kind of like to call it, like kind of a softer form of communism, a softer form of Marxism, the globalism, woke, and I think, Burnham did recognize this. He did distinguish, Burnham did, between, liberals and communists. He did not group, he recognized that not all liberals were communists. He believed that liberalism abetted communism because for Burnham, this is an argument he makes in Suicide of the West, is that, if liberalism prevails, the West is doomed because liberals can't fight communism, because the only group that liberals can really fight is conservatism. So therefore, Burnham reasons that if liberalism prevails, the West is doomed. So that's an argument he makes in Suicide of the West. But the point is that, he did distinguish between liberals and communists. He recognized that although globalism, globalization was, has some Marxist elements to it, it doesn't make it, akin to the Soviet Union. But, to some degree, he's right. There are neo-Marxist elements to, things like woke, DEI, globalism. So, and, he would have accurately seen both, I think, in my opinion, both the truth and the fiction in those when people try to associate all those movements.
Sure, and I hope I'm not guilty of bouncing back and forth too much, but you saying that just reminded me, what is the, and I know a hardliner like Burnham would have a ready answer, the Bay of Pigs or failures in Vietnam, say, but there were a lot of liberals in the United States of that era who prided themselves on their anti-communism. The Nixon Kennedy debates where they're almost tripping over each other as to who was the more anti-Russian candidate. It was they led us into Vietnam in a lot of ways. Now, again, they may have botched it. You could say they botched Bay of Pigs, but it's not as if they were saying, we can just sort of get along. They would probably take issue with this notion. What do you mean we're not fighting communism? Sure, we're not doing it as much as this guy might want, but it's just unfair to say if liberals took over, the world's going to fall because we don't see this enemy for what it is.
Right. And that goes back to Burnham's geopolitical philosophy that we need to use power, maybe even hard power, maybe even violence against the Soviet Union. And certainly, liberals were often reluctant to use that. Burnham says that liberals are naturally predisposed against violence. So therefore, whenever they do use violence, such as the Bay of Pigs, such as Vietnam, they use it awkwardly and incorrectly. So, yes, you're right. They did use violence in Vietnam, but Burnham says, they didn't use enough violence. So that's why everything's all messed up in Vietnam because, we used a little bit of violence, but not enough violence. Same with the Bay of Pigs. Democrats, liberals like Kennedy, they did kind of take an aggressive position in Cuba. They did kind of show power, but consistent with liberalism, it just wasn't enough power. So that's what Burnham said was the mistake that liberals always made. The reluctance to use violence meant, when they did use it, they used it incorrectly. They didn't use enough of it. So therefore, if liberalism prevails, we're just going to get overrun by communists because liberals can't effectively use force and violence. And he would have used Cuba and maybe even Vietnam as his evidence for that.
Yeah, and that's a story that's not just via communism. The war on terror, say even the Israel and Hamas or Russia and Ukraine, that it's one of the frequent, for those Republicans who are still on Ukraine's side, say, it's one of the frequent criticisms in the Biden administration. Yeah, his talking points are right, but he never backs it up with enough stuff, right? It's if this war could have been over if we'd have just actually been invested in the way he claims he is. This very common critique from the right to the left is that they just won't commit enough to get the job done.
Yeah. And that was something Burnham, regularly, Burnham emphasized the distinction between words and actions, words of politicians and their actions, the Machiavellians. He says, never trust the words that politicians use. He cited FDR. You can't trust his words, but instead look at their actions. Burnham cited the 1932 Democratic Convention platform. FDR says, we're going to cut the size of government. And, Burnham says, look, you can't trust these words of any of these politicians. And this is a theme that he would continue throughout his Cold War as a Cold Warrior. By arguing that, these words of the American, foreign policymakers don't really matter. Yes, they might use hard words, but, we need to use hard power, even soft power. Burnham always said words are meaningless, right? These treaties, these agreements, they mean nothing. So yeah, Burnham always distrusted words, and he never, he advocated that his readers, his followers, always distrust the words leaders use too.
I wanted to read two brief excerpts from your book, one toward the end, one at the beginning. At the end here, you're referring here to an article Burnham had written, The Web of Subversion. He said, it reads like one of the politically charged and ideologically driven articles that are the norm in American media today. It relies on guilt by association. The work is based on truths, but it is filled with half-truths and suggestions that can never really be proven or disproven, such as the assertion that communist subversions led to the victory of communism in China. This made it seductive, allowing the believer to rationalize the worst possible scenario. After all, it could not be disproven that communist agents had played a critical role in the shaping of U.S. foreign policy. And given this, it was not irrational to believe that they did. Soon after its release, a condensed conversion was published by the John Birch Society. We don't have time to get into all that, but I'll talk about guilt by association. And then the other here is you had mentioned the hiddenness is significant. And you're talking about, I think, the hiddenness of the power struggle and the managerial revolution, but especially of the Marxist in the United States or Western society. It's hidden. We don't know how deep the rabbit hole goes. We don't know how far it goes. We don't know how many there are. We just know they're there. We have some evidence it's there, but we don't know the extent to which it is. The hiddenness is significant, you're right, because the believer can attribute a vast array of phenomenon to the evil. The more hidden the evil becomes, whether it's Satan's minions, communism, or racism, the easier it becomes to assert its influence. If the evil were visible, it could be refuted by simply stating that no one saw it, and therefore it could not have existed when and where it had allegedly struck. Making the evil latent allows one to maximize its influence. And I read these both because I know in your introduction you talk about, look, what you're trying to do here is paint his intellectual journey, and you're not trying to defend or critique him necessarily, you're just trying to lay out his ideas. But when I read these sentences, I think there's latent critique here.
Yeah.
Because we certainly see buried in this. I mean, your mention of racism, we see this a lot today. It's a hidden threat that allows the individual who who perceives the world to be controlled by racist forces, which, let's acknowledge, that does exist, it allows them to expand it to such a degree that they can't really be refuted. In the same sense with Marxism here. So I'm asking this in a way of, you obviously have a deep amount of respect for Burnham, but what do you think the guy got wrong?
I think to some degree, he was just a little bit too much of an extremist. Like many right wing thinkers at the time. Certainly there were communists in the United States, but I think it's just exaggerated a little bit. Again, we gave the example of George Kennan. Other members of the Kennedy administration. These people are in no way, shape, or form were betting communists. So I think Burnham was a bit of a conspiracy theorist. And consistent with a lot of conspiracy theorists, they see things that aren't necessarily the way they really are. So I think again, Burnham in the book The Web of Subversion, which I argue, again, a lot of latent things, right? He specifically uses the word, I think, invisible thread, invisible communists. So, and again, when you do that, how can someone refute that? How can I say, well, look, that person's not really a communist if I can't even see him. So, and again, today racism too, everybody's racist. If you hang out with a racist, you're a racist. If you read, something that's racist, that makes you racist. And again, you hear invisible racism too. So I think really at both sides, you see just a little bit of exaggerations, and it's not always wrong, but sometimes it is. It's just really exaggerated. And that's true of both Burnham and some on the far right who tend to see, communism in everything, and those on the far left today who tend to see racism in everything. So, and I think Burnham, did have that tendency.
Burnham is obviously important, and you had written that in a lot of ways, the two Burnhams, we've talked about the neocon, the paleocon, just to reduce them to those words, in a lot of ways represents the fight within the GOP today, or the various factions. Who, in your view, best embodies the disciples of Burnham today? Is it Donald Trump? Is it Bill Kristol? Like, who is the Burnham of today?
Yeah, I think in terms of his, of course, you have to distinguish between the two. There's the more optimistic geopolitical strategist James Burnham, who kind of fueled neoconservatism, who says, democracy can prevail. Of course, 21st century neoconservatives would take this idea and apply it to the Middle East, right? They optimistically said democracy can prevail in Iraq, Afghanistan. I think Bill Kristol is a good example. Today, probably Paul Gottfried, he's the editor of Chronicles. He is a big disciple. So in terms of the paleoconservative ideas, the more pessimistic ideas of Burnham, specifically the idea that, America's burning, things are crumbling, America's in decline. These are more pessimistic Burnham that help fuel paleoconservatism. I think, Paul Gottfried would be a good example. He's the editor of a magazine called Chronicles, which, you read it regularly. It's pretty pessimistic about America's future. So I think, Bill Kristol, maybe the neoconservative, and, both of these figures, of course, they would acknowledge their debt to Burnham. They both say, we've read Burnham, we've been influenced by Burnham. So I think these are two good current examples of people who've been influenced by the two James Burnhams.
The name of your book, James Burnham, an intellectual. Let me get it here. James Burnham, an intellectual biography. Kudos on the cover, by the way. That's a very striking cover. It's
it was painted. Obviously it's the publisher's choice, and they didn't find pictures of Burnham that they liked, so they had an artist draw a picture, and the colors represent the same colors that were on the original Managerial Revolution. So if you find an original copy of the Managerial Revolution, they're kind of orange and greenish like that. So that's where the cover comes from.
Well, I will link to it in the show note. The book is out, just got out, so get your copy today upon hearing this, of course. David Byrne, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Josh. It's been great being here.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.